African moral wisdom is largely derived from the lived experiences of people. And it's also communicated similarly, like, take care of my child, I did this and this happened, right? It's similarly communicated and verbally. So it's like, let me tell you what happened to me when I encountered X and how I dealt with it. So the listener would infer from these lived experiences how these values apply both in principle and in practice. And perhaps, unlike their Western counterparts, African moral philosophers share their wisdom through oral traditions. And over time, those traditions are transmitted through myths and proverbs and folk tales and folk songs, right? And so that may also explain why Ubuntu as a moral philosophy has not had as much wide universality as maybe Confucius, because it's written down. And so that may be a thing, and that may be why it's still limited to, quite limited, but it's still more widely known by scholars in Southern Africa than it is across the world, like other philosophies are.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Literature, Language, Culture, a dialogue series from the University of Washington's English Department here in Seattle, Washington. I am your host, C.R. Grimmer, and today we have a special guest with us. Josie, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Josephine Walwema. I am a professor of technical and professional writing in the interdisciplinary writing program here at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Perfect. Thank you. And for those of you listening and watching, we'll have the URL to Josie's professional site on the department page, right? So you can see the classes that she's teaching, but people might find you elsewhere online to be in conversation, right? So where else might people see you online?
I have a Twitter handle. It's Josie, JOSIE _ Walwema, WALWEMA.
The English department has a variety of social channels you can find us on now, mostly to promote this series, but down the road, it will promote different initiatives in the department. So on Twitter, it's UW _ENGL, UW _Ingle, and it's the same on Instagram. And then for Facebook, it's the same thing with no underscores. So facebook.com/UWENGL. And of course, you'll find links to all of these things in the description below, podcast or YouTube version. One of the best things you can do to support the series is actually just hit the like, thumbs up button on this video and click subscribe to our channel. In fact, if the department gets enough subscribers by the end of next year, we'll be able to create our own custom YouTube URL. So if it's not within your means to support the program in other ways, like and subscribe can go a long way. Josie, what did you bring to talk about with us today?
Today, I'm going to speak to you about Ubuntu. Have you heard about Ubuntu? Probably. It is not the operating system that people use. It is a set of normative ethics that are espoused by the Bantu speaking people of Southern Africa. So loosely translated, Ubuntu can mean humanity or humanness or even humaneness, right? The trouble with translating Ubuntu into English is that it doesn't quite convey the essence of the word, right? And so in order to capture its essence, scholars have tried to tease out its meaning by tracing it to the maxim that gave it being. And the maxim belongs to the Ndebele speaking people, or the Xhosa, I can't say that as well as I should, or the Zulu, because these are all Bantu speaking people. And they have a maxim that goes, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, What that means is a person is a person through other persons. So that's how scholars have tried to describe or translate the word Ubuntu so that it makes sense for non-Bantu speakers in general, right? So if you're a person because you're a person through other persons, you're speaking of a communitarian form of ethics, right? You belong to other people.
In this system and in this translation, person's not necessarily referring to legal personhood, or is it? Is it thinking more about like person as in the like who you are, like a being, or does it mean
Yes.
person like,
It's speaking to persons as human beings, as people who can be with other people. Another way of thinking about it is you can contrast it with Descartes, Descartes' individualism, who says, I think, therefore I am. That is sharp departure from Ubuntu, because Ubuntu assumes that you think because you belong to other people, right? So maybe the fact that it means person evokes sort of a dialectical relationship between being and becoming. Desmond Tutu, he once said that to give high praise to someone is to say, so and so has Ubuntu. So again, if you can go back to the humanity, they have humanity of humaneness, or so to have Ubuntu is to live well and to be guided by moral values and to flourish by meeting obligations to other people, because it makes you human rather than subhuman.
What are some sort of complications to it that you think are worthwhile noting?
Well, first and foremost is it's communitarianism. The critique against communitarianism is that it diminishes the autonomy of the individual, right? And it's likely to retrain individual right to self-expression, and that individuals might feel obligated to maintain fealty to their communities without question. So that's one critique, and I think it's a valid one. And I think we see a lot of that sometimes within our communities where people are accused of having herd mentality or that kind of thing. The other way is that critics say that acquiring Ubuntu for one's well-being negates the well-being of others, right? Like if you are focused on acquiring Ubuntu for yourself, what does that mean for others, right? That given that Ubuntu is very much an individualistic enterprise. So it's like, on the one hand, it's communitarian, but on the other, it's the individual who has to acquire it. So what gives, right? And that in bringing I am because we are. So if you contrast it with Descartes, it would be I am because we are. And therefore that might enable an individual to evade responsibility in the name of collectivism. Another critique that I see is valid is that it subsumes the multiculturalism of the Bantu speaking people, because the Bantu speakers range from across sub-Saharan Africa. And I myself am a Bantu speaker, but I had never heard of Ubuntu until I started reading widely, right? So assuming that Ubuntu, because we are Bantu speakers, means that we all have the same kind of normative ethics is a criticism that people have. And along with that is that if Bantu speakers have espoused this kind of communitarian ethics, how do they explain the atrocities that people inflict on other people, right? And by rulers and those kinds of things. And for this last one, I might say, that the same question could be put to the Greeks who espoused virtue ethics, and yet, they had slaves. They wielded violence and they upheld the institution of slavery, even though they gave us so much in the name of virtue ethics and other kinds of ethics. So those are the major critiques that I would say.
So how has ethics become a kind of through thread of the scholarly field around it, basically?
So one of the defining characteristics of technical communication is that you have to communicate clearly, succinctly, and effectively, right? But none of those forms of communication speak to what the effects of your clear, effective communication has on people. So when I talk about Steve Katz's ethic of expediency, for example, examined a memo that had been written very succinctly, very effectively, very clearly, and therefore it met all the standards of technical communication. It was perfection, I guess. But it had deadly consequences because it outlined the mechanisms for transporting people into gas chambers. So that's where ethics comes in. Are we, as technical and professional communicators, simply going to communicate effectively and clearly without paying attention to the effects of our communication? That's where ethics comes in. And the turn to social justice, on the other hand, has examined technical communication as being a neutral field, an objective field, because that's how it was conceived when it first started. It's neutral, it's objective. But is technical communication really neutral? So we have scholars in the field who have examined documents, like a colleague of mine, a friend of mine did, was looking at election documents and how they disenfranchised African Americans. So even though these are objective documents, they are not neutral because they're designed in ways that disenfranchise other people. And if I may put in another example, is a paper I recently published in Technical Communication Quarterly, which examined how academic job advertisements exclude international scholars, even though they're written objectively and they meet all the qualities of technical communication. They nevertheless include language that's exclusionary. So on the one hand, they say this institution does not discriminate against people based on their national origin, etc. But within those documents, you'll find language that actually discriminates. That's why ethics are so important in technical and professional communication.
What does the framework you're discussing, you think, teach us about professional and technical communication, and what type of ethical frameworks can it help us live into?
Well, I'm thinking that given that technical and professional communication has now gotten a global reach, it's become global and expansive in its reach, and therefore a global universal outlook to ethics is warranted, one that goes beyond the ethics of the Greeks. So technical and professional communication has its roots in Western rhetorics. And those ethics, perhaps at the expense of others, fail to account for the global ethics of people that it seeks to interact with. So because technical communication has kind of been excused for perpetuating unethical tenets where there's no articulation of norms or that are rooted in the humanity of the people that it seeks to engage with, where technical communication can pretend it's neutral and objective all at once and then go into I don't know into a community that's not rooted in Western ideals and try to act like it's neutral, but that doesn't make it neutral. I mean, even here, right here in the United States, I was listening to NPR a while back, and they were talking about way when life was normal, why Hispanics do not go to the national parks. And there's something technical and professional communication about, because the national parks are not sold as places for people of color to go and have leisure in. These are sold as places of people who have means and places of people who can fly from I don't know where and go camping and take time off, right? All of these things are examples of professional and technical communication that that doesn't recognize the societies in which it is practiced. So we can conceive of values as being universal, but we can also acknowledge the cultural dynamism of people and attempt to speak to what those people value and how it might impact the way you communicate with them. It sounds it is hopeful, I believe. I think it is hopeful. I think everything from right now we're arguing about the results of an election. And let's not forget that prior to that election, there had been laws and statutes that were passed to make it impossible, make it difficult, have people jump through hoops. And people did jump through those hoops and met the new requirements. And yet their vote is still being discounted, right? I think about, there's a story some woman shared a story on Twitter where she's a Black woman. She went in for surgery. And when she came out of surgery, she noticed that her hair was different. And she found out that the surgeon, who was a Black surgeon and had daughters, had redid her hair so that the incision would not leave a place where would be covered by her hair. Those are the kinds of it makes me tremble actually when I think about that. Those are the kinds of Ubuntu relationships. This doctor saw her as a person, as a, and I think maybe one final friend, which is not an example from here. I have a friend who is a dentist. He's from the UK, but he had immigrated to Australia. And he told me this story about how he was a little bit lost at first. And then one time he was in the hospital, and then he was called into a room. And I don't know why he was called into a room. He's a dentist anyway. But the patient was an older woman, and everybody had been saying that this older woman was a handful, was too much, like a problem patient, if you will. And he said when he walked in, he saw her and she reminded him of his grandmother. And he sat down with her. And from that moment on, he became the person who was speaking with her because he made a connection with her. That's Ubuntu, Granted, it took him seeing her as a grandmother to perhaps understand her, understand her anxieties, but nevertheless, it served both of them well in the end because she got to be heard and he got to be a doctor in that moment.
Because it makes you think about like how many knowledge systems and different value sets we could be living into if we were better at listening to and experiencing and honoring other forms of knowledge as much as the topical elements. So instead of it being like, so we need to translate it to the Western scholarly essay, right? It might be that folks who have grown up in that system need to learn how to listen and watch better for other forms.
So I have argued that intercultural communication could be served by examining other texts that are not print-based, that are not written text. And I argue that today, in the world of global media, we can access these texts as videos on YouTube, as audio clips, as paintings. All of these are sources of knowledge that capture the essence of a people. I mean, think about hieroglyphics, what they tell us about the Egyptians. Like, do we discard them because they're not written and bound in alphabetic form? So I have argued that in order for us to I think to communicate ethically with people is we cannot just limit ourselves to the written word and the scholarly publications, because we all know what scholarship does. There's a lot of gatekeeping in scholarship. Basically, you're perpetuating the same epistemology and leaving out what is essential um, to maybe widening the lens or the aperture of how we see other people.